Mm. Yeah, I think we can start now. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. Our today's guest speaker, Professor Mina Hosseinipour is very remarkable. Our Dr. Mina Hosseinipour is a professor of medicine at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the scientific director of UNC Project Malawi. She is an infectious diseases physician who has lived and worked in Malawi for 22 years. She has been the investigator of record for several AIDS clinical trials group and the HIV prevention trials unit clinical trials. She is a co-principal investigator for the clinical trials unit. She is also the co-principal investigator on Forgetty D43 training grant, NIMH U19 grant, and NIHLBI Forgetty U24 grant. She has organized many grant writing workshops for the UNC Project Malawi team and has helped many early career researchers to write their first NIH grant. Today, she's going to finish our discussion of the approach section of the NIH grant. So thank you, and over to you, Dr. Mina.
Thank you very much. I'm going to fully acknowledge that I adapted these slides from Dr. Brad Gaines, one of the professors in the Department of Psychiatry that works with us and also helps with our grant writing. Because one thing to know when you're writing an approach or you're doing a lot of good work is that sometimes if you have a really nice template already, it's okay to follow it, because if it was a successful template the first time, it may be successful the second time as well. So that's just a little lesson, a pearl. And so I think this was discussed as the approach is the how of what you're going to do. It's like describing exactly the details of how this project will come together. So it's your point to sell your idea in terms of, here's how I can get the answer to my research question. And it's actually the area that's most likely to get criticism in your proposal. So people will look at your aims first, and if they hate them, they might not even get to this part of the grant, or they'll be influenced. But if they get to this is where they're really looking at areas to sort of say, no, that'll never work. No, I don't believe they can do that, and so forth. So that's why approach is really important. Now, I think this may have been discussed a little bit, that these are all of the sections that go into an approach section. And in how you label that, now I'm doing overview, then rationale, then preliminary. Some people will just have it bulleted like this. Other people will do something like D.1, D.2, D.3. I don't think that matters so much. It's just to say that it's an expectation that all of these different elements will be included in your approach section. And a couple of these I'm going to detail a little bit more. So your approach, I think this was discussed last week as well. It should map to your aims. So if you said you're doing something in your aims, now is your opportunity to expand that. So, you know, it needs to be in the order of your aims, give or take. It needs to sort of follow the logic of your aims. And when you're doing this, you will want to, you're in page limits. You only have 12 pages for R01. You have 6 pages for your R21. So you always have to be very concise. So you're going to condense your text to reduce any redundancy. So an example will be is if your study population is the same for all of your aims, then you are only going to describe the study population once. but then you may need a separate analysis section for each aim. So a lot of it depends on how your aims are written as to how you're going to write different sections of your approach. What do I mean by a rationale? A rationale is not why you're doing the research, it's why you're choosing the approach you are taking. This is sometimes introduced in the alternative strategies section that is towards the end. But if you have a major area that you want to describe from the beginning why you have chosen to do a cluster randomized trial over a step wedge cluster randomized trial, it might be here that you would want to sort of set that stage. So it's something to map from the beginning that you've thought carefully about how you're approaching your research question. And this would answer questions that a reviewer's going to be thinking of from the beginning. You sort of set your stage early. Now, preliminary studies are another component. Oh, should I stop and take the raised hands before I move on, or just surge through? Maybe I'll come back to it, because I really did make this short so that we can talk more, have more time for discussion. So preliminary studies are an opportunity to show that you've done the work. And there's no better way to show that you can do work is if you have a history of doing that work. So you want to say, here's the work that we've done. Here's how we're building on that work and why this work is important and why my project now is the next logical step to this preliminary work that I've done. It also lets you highlight that you have a team that can do the work. And you may have done a lot of work in other areas, but the preliminary studies are telling your story of how you've developed to this research proposal, not, like all of your work. So it does need to be focused on how this preliminary work sets the foundation for what you're doing next. For outcomes, you need to be sure that your aims map to the outcomes, and it should be clear from your aims and hypotheses what those specific outcomes are. Often you use techniques like tables or bullets to clearly define this is the outcome. It makes it obvious to the reviewers so that you're having an obvious definition of what your outcome is. Important to know that your statistician does more than your sample size. They will help you with your power calculations, will help review that this section is important for feasibility. And it's important to justify your assumptions for the calculation. Nobody's gonna whip out their sample size calculations and double check, but they'll wonder what went into that. So you need to have outlined what some of those assumptions were. And sometimes a table with the different assumptions can be helpful to the reviewer to know that you thought about that. Also in the sample size section, you need to demonstrate that you can recruit your expected sample size and work through how many people are seen, what number will be approached, how many will consent, what will be your retention. So all of that are things that you really highlight in the sample size and statistical section. And this is an example from recent grants that we did. You're always limited on space. So this is just to highlight for the This table, we were looking at whether there was a 10% increase in persistence or 15% increase, and what would be our power differences according to our persistence at 12 months and 6 months. So here you can see we're powered only if we have a 15% increase. We included also what alpha and intercluster coefficient we were working on. This is another example where it's showing that we're looking at having an effect size of 10 percentage different or 15, and we have a fixed number of students, and then we were varying the intercluster correlation that you need for cluster randomized trials. And that allowed us to understand the number of clusters that we needed. So these are just examples of how you might vary one of your assumptions in a table and then still present it in a way that the reviewer will understand. For limitations and potential problems, it's important to admit that any research grant has some limitations. It can have challenges, and you need to discuss the alternatives that you may have done part of this in the rationale, but you need to discuss why you made the choices that you did and why your selected design was the strongest. If you identify a potential problem, you should also highlight that you have a solution and a strategy to address that problem. And it should be huge. It shouldn't be huge list of things that make your research seem unwieldy or impossible. It should just be the major points that you think a reviewer might think of. And I generally don't have this more than half a page. Types of things that might come in are missing data approaches, strategies to minimize missing data, or strategies to minimize loss to follow-up. A lot of us do implementation science work in the HIV sphere, so we know that the guidelines are getting changed all of the time. Every year there's a new guideline. And how is your research designed so it could accommodate changes in guidelines? Your choice of design, if it wasn't discussed in rationale, it might be discussed here. And then another thing that I work with a lot in cluster randomized trial is how do my standard of care sites not get contaminated by the intervention, by some type of overlap, or other studies coming in and inserting a different standard of care. So those are the types of things you might think about depending on your research study. Also finish up with future directions and an impact statement. This is saying where the research will lead next. It lets the reviewer finish reading on a positive note. And it's brief. It's not that you're selling every point of your grant all over again. It's just a brief paragraph with some take-home messages of how important your work is. Integrating the grant makes sure that your tables and figures refer to the appropriate areas. Don't take up tons of space describing yourself again when you can refer to the biosketch. And if you have a strong letter of support, be sure to highlight that, that it exists. So now I'm happy to take a bunch of questions, and I'm going to perhaps go back to sort of the different sections to start fielding questions. Okay. Let me answer questions. I saw some hands. All right, I don't see any questions in the Q&A or chat function right now. Let me go to raised hands.
Dr. Hussainipour, I think let me try and allow those who raise hands to speak or turn on their mics. I'm just trying to figure out the settings here. Okay. Oh, okay. I've managed to do it for Thomas. I see your hand raised.
Okay. Can I speak? Wow. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. It's been an eye-opening section. Now, my question is, when I'm conducting my preliminary studies, if I have an issue, maybe I'm not able to get some of the results the right way because of lack of funding and maybe equipment during the preliminary studies, am I expected to write that these academics having getting the result appropriate because of lack of maybe materials or whatever? Or am I expected to just overlook that and then still write on my challenges during the research? How am I supposed to approach that aspect during?
You were breaking up a little bit.
Hello?
Maybe it was me breaking up.
Okay. If I am having issue, hello?
We can hear you, but it's also sort of breaking up a little on my end. Maybe could you find maybe just like somewhere with like a slightly better connection, and we can get back to your question like in a short while.
Okay. Maybe let me type the question.
Okay, that'll be great. Thank you so much. And in the meantime, should we go over to Kingsley? I see you.
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. Please, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. This presentation has been very awesome. And I was just kind of following up in some of the grant applications that we try to write that requires multiple methods, maybe combination of methods, and each of the methods having its own either limitation. How do we approach writing it or reflecting it in the rationale? So we have maybe a cohort study that at some point we want to do some qualitative study of some of the study participants. And we want to reflect this in the rationale of the study. How do we reflect it in the rationale of the study during the grant application? Thank you.
So you want to do some mixed methods approach?
Yes.
I guess so go back to, so it may be in your overview, you would say how you're approaching this is a mixed method study incorporating qualitative methods in 1 and 2, and is a quantitative study for aim 3. So it might be the rationale, and then you'd include the rationale of why you're choosing methods as sort of your next section. So that would be, your overview is to sort of give just that. Sometimes you use like or a figure that connects all of the pieces aims in a figure so that somebody can go right from the beginning to sort of see how the pieces fit together. And you would have so I think some of it, and the selection depends a little bit on your study, and your study design. So these parts have to be, hey, sorry, I have dogs. So it varies grant to grant as to how you put these together. And I guess helpful, you want a print, but since every grant is a bit unique, how the that you gather based on having. Let me throw these dogs out.
Thanks, Professor Husseinipour. I think like the sound was coming in and out a little bit, but I think we could definitely catch most of it. Thanks so much, Kingsley, for your question as well. I do see some questions in the chat, in the Q&A. That's great. I think we'll just take one more. I saw one more hand up, and then we'll go to those questions. So Olayemi Balogun, would you like to ask a question? Otherwise, okay, in the meantime, while we wait for that, I think I do see some questions. So Thomas is back with a question in the chat. How do I report my challenges due to the lack of appropriate equipment during preliminary studies? Should I try to avoid the discussion, or should I report it in the proposal?
Well, I think that if it's going to be obvious to a reviewer, you should address it. So if you had what I guess if it's in your preliminary studies and now you're correcting that with this grant, I would highlight in your preliminary studies. My previous work has included this. We found this, it was incomplete because we had a lack of some equipment. However, with this grant, I will be resolving that problem. And that's one of the reasons for the grant. So that would be sort of how I would frame that. If you know that you had a barrier in your preliminary work and it's going to be addressed by your grant now, the logic is just state that you have not yet fully evaluated this because of the lack of equipment, which will be remedied by this grant proposal. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Professor Husseinipour. I think that's great response, and Thomas, feel free to respond in the chat as well. So we've got I think about 6 minutes left till half hour. Till we're at the half hour, so I'll just try and consolidate some of the questions in the Q&A. So I see two of them relating to preliminary studies. So one of them is asking, do we need to include preliminary data for specific aims or have a general preliminary data section? And also one more says, can one cite unpublished data or work in a preliminary study section? So these two address the preliminary studies.
Yes, you can definitely cite unpublished work in your preliminary data section. That certainly, it's work that you've done, it's your work, you can cite that as your preliminary work. So that's I'd even encourage it if it supports what you're going to be proposing. And then you don't have to necessarily have preliminary data for all of your specific aims. I like the preliminary data as a separate section. If your aims are very disparate, then it might make sense to put the preliminary data. If you can write a approach by aim and like it's all self-contained with the aim, then you might put the preliminary data in that. Generally, I think having a preliminary data section as an overall fits better, but I would not say that's universal. Most of the grants I've written have preliminary data as one section rather than integrated into each aim. With the exception of if you're writing an analysis plan and some of the assumptions of your, sample size analysis require that preliminary data, then I would have it in that section of the grant. In the sample size calculation is based on a previous work that demonstrated 40% retention, for example. So that would be a place where you might put your preliminary data and the assumption is based on your preliminary data to form your sample size. That would be a better place for it.
Thank you, Professor. So there are several questions also on sort of risk mitigation and alternative strategies. One question is, would you include the methodology for alternative strategies, or just mention that there are alternatives? And there's another question also by Prof. Tang on what's the key things that need to be taken into consideration in risk mitigation. I guess this kind of address the risk mitigation alternative strategy section.
Okay, yes. Like I said, the alternative strategy / limitation is not going to be more than half a page. You don't want it to be very long. You want it to be very directed to things that you think the reviewers are going to highlight. So you wouldn't go elaborately into what would be the benefits of a different methodology. You might merely say, we considered this methodology and felt the shortcomings associated with that methodology of X, X, and X tempered our enthusiasm for that approach. Our approach highlights these strengths or would have avoided these limitations. It's very specific to your grant what that alternative strategy would be, but you wouldn't go into great detail. You just say, we did not consider that because for our setting, these issues would likely result in a less robust study. For the additional question about risk mitigation, people are always worried about if some calamity happens, like, a COVID pandemic, cyclone like has just hit Malawi, what strategies might be in place? Those are types of risk mitigations if they seem very likely that could happen. It could, I think the more likely scenarios might be if this instrument failed, I would use this instrument. Or if this, like I have a backup lab, so those are types of mitigation strategies that you might come up with. What those mitigation strategies are, they all depend on what your grant is trying to answer. So I may be using a lot of implementation science kind of examples because those are the type of grants I've most recently submitted. So the examples I gave were related to that. I mean, examples of what we said, to prevent contamination, we will work closely with the Ministry of Health, parentheses, letter of support, and our PEPFAR implementing partners to align our activities. And that might be all that I'd say, is to say, I've thought about it. I've got partnerships that will help me work through that. If it's a lab assay, I'd highlight my colleague has agreed to run samples for me in the event of a failed sample, or like something that shows that you've thought about what would be the biggest barriers to your research not going forward.
All right. Thank you, Professor Hosseinipour. So I think we're just a minute over the half hour. I know that there are, I think, just 1 or 2 more questions left. Joe, would you like to say something? I see you if I'm muted.
Thanks, Rainer, and thanks, Dr. Hosseinipour. This is fantastic. Do you, I think it's fine if you'd like to take a few more questions, that's fine. If you need to go, Dr. Hosseinipour, that's fine too.
If there's something burning, I can stay a bit longer for questions. But if there isn't anything burning, because your question is very grant specific and I don't know your grant, then I'm fine either way.
Okay, yeah. And I think the other thing is, for the folks who are going into small groups, there'll be other opportunities, and yeah, but this is great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hosseinipour. It's really, it's fantastic completion of the approach section, and thanks for joining us today and giving this talk. And the other point, just for everyone on the call, we will have a certificate of completion for those, for people who are interested in getting a certificate. You will need to have joined at least 5 out of the 6 sessions, and it's fine to watch a video on the archive that Yusha just put into the chat box. And then the other requirement for getting a certificate is you need to have actually some kind of draft version of your grant application. So putting it into action. Those are the 2 things. Our last session will be next week on Tuesday, the 28th. Basically, Lauren and Yusha will be going through some Q&A, assembling. We put together a list of some questions that have come up across the whole Grant-o-thon workshop, and we'll be going through questions and answers, and then we'll also give you a final survey instrument, a final kind of assessment of how things went, strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, thanks everyone again for joining us today, and thanks again to Dr. Hosseinipour.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.